So, welcome everybody. Welcome to Maastricht at this festive occasion. I'd like to hereby open this academic ceremony in which Max Brüning will defend the academic thesis essays on well-being, major life events and economics. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the degree committee, dear colleagues, family and friends. Hallo Oma und Opa. Welcome to the defense of my thesis entitled Essays on Wellbeing, Major Life Events and Economics. I would like to start by giving you a big picture overview of what my thesis is about, and we can take big picture overview quite literally by having a look at the cover of my thesis. At the very top, you have a heart held by two hands, symbolizing well-being. Well-being is the overarching theme that connects all three research chapters in my thesis. In the second row of the cover, you have the three life events that are analyzed in each chapter. The first life event is romantic separation, symbolized by the two broken marriage rings. The next one is internal migration, symbolized by the house key, and the last one is mortality, symbolized by the hourglass. Now, I analyze well-being around these three life events, and I connect this analysis to economics. In the case of the first two research chapters, this is the rational agent perspective, a microeconomic theory of human behavior that I will explain a bit more on a little later on. And the first two chapters on migration and divorce are microeconomic, meaning they analyze individual behavior. The last chapter on mortality is macroeconomic, meaning it analyzes aggregate behavior of many human beings at once. And there the economic link is that I link mortality to macroeconomic activity. So for the remainder of my presentation, I would first like to tell you about microeconomic perspectives on divorce and housing. Then I will show you the results of these chapters. And then lastly, I will tell you about macroeconomic perspectives on well-being and show you the results of the last research chapter on mortality. So let's jump right into it. When microeconomists do any kind of research, really, they usually start from a rational agent perspective, meaning that they assume that people are rational actors that compare the options that they have in life and make choices according to their preferences. Putting this slightly differently, they make choices to maximize their utility. And utility is an abstract concept. In most applied research, this is set equivalent to well-being. This is why the rational agent perspective is symbolized by a head with two cogwheels in it, because this theory assumes that people are kind of like thinking machines that constantly weigh the pros and cons of different options that present themselves in their lives. And the head looks at the symbol for well-being, because well-being is kind of the decision criteria for humans in this model. Based on these simple assumptions, we can make a prediction, and that is that people will reveal their preferences with the choices they make. So if we observe a human doing something, they are doing it because this improves their well-being. And this prediction we can apply to the events, to the life events of divorce and internal migration. And in doing so, we can formulate research questions or hypotheses. For a divorce to happen, at least one partner in the relationship must want it. So that partner should become better off through the divorce. They should improve their well-being through the divorce. This is the first hypothesis. In a divorce, it's possible that not both partners want the divorce, but only one. So the other partner does not want the divorce, and then, according to this theory, should become worse off or experience decreases in their well-being through the divorce. This is what I can say about divorce. Now we can also apply this prediction to migration, and then we get a specific hypothesis, that is that people that move, that decide to move, should expect to improve their well-being through the move. All right, that's the theory. So let's look a bit at the results, or how I answered these research questions or tested these hypotheses. For the case of divorce, first I have to somehow measure well-being. And I do this by using survey data on life satisfaction. So in the survey that I use, people were asked, in general, how satisfied are you with your life right now on a scale of 0 to 10? People could answer that, and in the survey I could identify 1,150 occasions in which a person separated from their romantic partner in either a cohabitating or in a married relationship. Now I can compare these people that experience a separation to people that stayed in a relationship, and this gives me the following results. In this figure, on the x-axis, you can see the time to separation. So I analyzed people that had a separation from 4.5 years before the separation until 4.5 years after the separation. On the y-axis, you have the changes in life satisfaction that these people experienced. And the black line shows how people did that wanted, that initiated the separation. You also have confidence intervals around these point estimates, 95% confidence intervals, and I use the year immediately before the separation, or half a year on average before the separation, as the reference category, which is why there are no confidence intervals there. Now, if we look at how the black line looks from 4.5 years before to 4.5 years after the separation, we can see that people's life satisfaction decreases. It decreases until it reaches the lowest point immediately after the separation, but after that, the life satisfaction goes up again until it reaches roughly the same level 4.5 years after the separation compared to 4.5 years before the separation. So it's, in a way, it's a V shape, yeah? Now for initiators, those people that wanted a divorce, these results are consistent with the theory I laid out before, meaning that it looks like if we look at the time period after the separation, those people became better off. The line goes up after the separation, indicating their satisfaction is higher, and I proxy well-being with this satisfaction answer. Now, I told you before, it's not everybody in a divorce wants the divorce. We can also look at what happens to people that did not initiate divorce. For them, while there is a slight decrease that we can observe in the line before the separation, it is not significant. You can see that because the confidence intervals overlap with the 0 line. So this decrease is not significant, but then if we look at the change from immediately before to immediately after the separation, half a year after the separation, there's a massive decrease by around 0.75. So people that did not initiate the separation become much less satisfied with their life immediately after the separation, but eventually it also increases again. So then at the 4.5 years after the separation, they're also at very similar levels of life satisfaction as they were 4.5 years before. This pattern is also consistent with the theory I laid out before, in that people, the non-initiators, did experience a decrease in their life satisfaction, even though it's not permanent. All right, those were the results with respect to divorce. Let's look at the other life event, migration. For migration, I use the same life satisfaction question, but I then don't look at divorced people, but people that migrate, and I find 353 individuals that migrated in my sample, and to enter the sample, they had to migrate by more than 50 kilometers. The figure looks slightly different because if you look at the x-axis, you only see 2 points, half a year after and 1.5 years after the move. So I don't look at migration from 4.5 years to 4.5 years afterwards, but only look at what happens to them after the move. And here, if we look at the results, we see that the point estimates are both slightly positive, but in both cases, these results are not significant, which we can see because the confidence intervals overlap with the zero line. Now, these results do not immediately directly support the theory I laid out before, but they also don't necessarily contradict it, because we look at a very short-term horizon here, and we do not know how life satisfaction develops in the long run. All right, those were the 2 microeconomic chapters of my thesis. Let's look at how macroeconomists think about well-being. And here you can see the factory symbol set equal to the well-being symbol. This is to say that macroeconomists tend to think of macroeconomic activity as a proxy for well-being, that it indicates well-being. So when the macroeconomy is doing well, we assume that well-being also increases. This is an economic perspective on it. We also then, if we look at another indicator of well-being, or rather a contra-indicator, this is mortality, symbolized by the hourglass. So here, if well-being increases, mortality should decrease, right? So if less people die, we would assume that well-being is higher. So the question this chapter asked then is, how are macroeconomic conditions and mortality associated? Because if the macroeconomic activity increases, gets better, then this indicates better well-being according to macroeconomic thought. So at the same time, mortality should decrease if the 2 indicators of well-being kind of point into the same direction. And that's the question I try to answer in this chapter. To answer this question, I looked at macroeconomic activity in form of the unemployment rate in France. And I do this on the regional level of French départements, which are French administrative regions. And I ran regressions of all-cause mortality on the unemployment rate, and you can see the results in this table. We have results from 3 different regressions. Regressions measure correlation in a slightly more complex way. So you can think of these coefficients that you see as kind of correlation. And the outcome variable is all-cause mortality. Then in column 1 for the whole population, we look at mortality in the whole population and how it's related to the unemployment rate. And we find a coefficient of 0.0013. And with a standard error of 0.0009, meaning that while the coefficient is positive, it's not statistically significant. So we do not find an association between the mortality rate and all-cause mortality and the unemployment rate. Now we can run the same analysis for female mortality only, and then we get a coefficient that is minus 0.0005, also not significant. However, when we run this analysis for men, we find a positive coefficient that is statistically significant, meaning that if the unemployment rate increases, then male mortality also increases. And this is consistent with the kind of thinking I laid out before. So if the unemployment rate increases, that means macroeconomic activity decreases. So well-being, we would expect, also decreases. And since mortality increase, that is actually, it should make sense. It should be the case, but I got lost in my train of thought there. So the unemployment rate increases, macroeconomic activity goes down, so well-being goes down, and this is also equivalent also obvious from the other indicator of well-being from an increase in the mortality rate. That's the right way around. All right, so that were the results from my last chapter on mortality. Let me conclude now. So, in accordance with the microeconomic theory that I laid out before, the rational agent perspective, the chapter on separation finds that initiators improve their well-being after separation, while non-initiators experience short-run deteriorations. In chapter 3, I analyzed internal migration and found that there's no effect on short-run well-being. And in chapter 4, the macroeconomic study of my thesis, I found that regional fluctuations in macroeconomic activity have little impact on aggregate mortality in France, but they do have an impact on some sources of mortality, like male mortality. Only the impact on on all-cause mortality is not statistically significant. Thank you very much. This was my presentation.
Thank you very much for your presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor Dr. Tim Huyts. He's a professor of positive health at work and works at the Institute ROA, which is a part of the UM and SPE, University of Maastricht. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, I would like to start by congratulating you and your supervisors with this very interesting thesis. And your results reveal that it's important to consider multiple outcomes and dimensions of well-being when looking at the impact of major life events. So I think that's a really important insight. I also really appreciated how you combined insights from various disciplines in your thesis, and you really integrated these rather than just putting them together, summing them up. So my compliments for that. Of course, I also have some questions for you. My questions focus on chapter 4. In which you explore the relationship between fluctuations in macroeconomic activity and mortality. And based on insights from various disciplines, you contrasted two main perspectives. So one argues that mortality is higher at economic downturns, and one posits that mortality could also increase when economic conditions improve. But I missed a third perspective, and that perspective also goes back to the work of Durkheim. And this perspective argues that it's not downturns or improvements as such that drive mortality, but change or upheaval. So regardless of whether the changes are positive or negative, when things rapidly change economically, that contributes to anomie, and that could contribute to changes in health and well-being. So I was just wondering whether this third perspective would also have value for you for interpreting the findings that you have. And I would like to have your thoughts on that.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this very interesting question. I think this third perspective, that if I understand you correctly, is that just economic change can also already influence well-being or mortality, whether there's any value to that. And I think it definitely is. And there's one study by Agion and a co-author titled Creative Destruction and Well-Being, I think, in which they try to actually analyze this question, but they may also have a focus on downturns. And what they do very interestingly from an economist perspective, what I'm interested in, or what I think is very interesting, is whether technological change influences well-being or even negatively impacts it. Because as an economist, if we think about increasing well-being in the long term, we want to have economic growth. Our growth models tells us that the most important factor in the long run is technological change. Now, so I think what we see in society, so this is very speculative, this is a bit my political view, but what we see, or how it makes sense to me, is that technological change is super good in the long run. As countries grow richer, like if we imagine our world in 100 years from now, we will have amazing technological opportunities, people will live longer lives, there's better health care, we have all kind of fancy gadgets, but the technological change to get there will cause a lot of societal change that will also create winners and losers. And it will also be just uncomfortable for people to go through that change, for example. So I think in the long run that artificial intelligence, for example, has lots of opportunities for people, but everybody now that has a job in writing something has to learn about this technology. And I think a lot of people do not enjoy changing their way, or they have been doing a job 5 years in a similar way, so that they feel like, oh, I'm doing well this way, now I have to change how I do my job just because there's this new technology. So I think then there are some people that enjoy this opportunity and there are other people that do not. Let me try to think whether I can add something to that. Yeah, I think maybe already in the word creative destruction, that dichotomy is already apparent. It's not like creative improvement, it's called creative destruction. And destruction is, I think, for most people more like negatively associated. And I think this is why this expression is so famous, because creative, it's like a good thing that it is, but it destroys something. How is that good? So I think when we just look at how society names these things, that's maybe also already evidence that there is value to the perspective that you mentioned, that change in itself may also be seen as something inconvenient, even if, as I have argued, there are large benefits to it in the long run.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll hand back to you, Pro-Rector.
Thank you. Then we will continue the opposition with Dr. Anne Solas. She's a senior researcher at INET based in Paris, France. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be in this committee. So I first congratulate Max for this very good work. The 3 chapters constitute really a solid piece of research and use well-done methodology, and 2 of the chapters have already given an international publication. So congrats. I have, of course, questions that I have concentrated on the first chapter, the first article, so 2nd chapter. That deals with the consequences of separation in several domains of life. While most of the previous literature distinguished between consequences by gender, here you distinguish people according whether they initiate or not the marital separation, and additionally also by gender. So I like very much this chapter, and I have 3 main questions. First, I wonder, to what extent the different effects you find for initiator and non-initiators may come from the fact that initiators have, in a certain way, prepared the separation, because they are in mind maybe 2 years or 1 year before the separation, while for non-initiator it's really unexpected even, in terms of rights and really theory of divorce. So maybe the difference you find is just a timing effect, because for non-initiator the separation is unexpected, while for the other it has been in a certain way prepared. And so I would like also to see more description of this the outcome before separation, because you artificially make initiator and non-initiator the same reference point 1 year before divorce, but maybe already they differ. So that's why my first question. My second.
Sorry that I interrupt. Have you been able to take notes for the first question? Is it clear?
I think, yeah, if I can quickly summarize it, it's basically whether differences between initiators and non-initiators are due to the fact that initiators are more likely to anticipate the separation and can prepare, while non-initiators are not.
Exactly.
Okay, great.
Then move on with the second question.
So my second question is about the paradox that women lose more after divorce than men in economic terms, not in well-being, but in economic terms. and while they still remain mainly the initiator of the separation. So what does this result mean? Given that the decrease of living standards after divorce is expected, or does it mean that women tend to value less money relatively to other domains of life? Maybe it is that they are much more unsatisfied about marital life and ready to separate even if the economic price is higher for them. So, and this is, I think, interesting because you do not find a result for the well-being and economic consequences of for initiator. And
Sorry.
I think
The question, I don't think the candidate...
Yeah, unfortunately the audio is a bit unclear, so I could not completely follow your question on...
okay.
So
maybe I can try without my cat. Tell me if it is better now.
Yeah, I think so, a bit, yeah.
Try again, yeah.
Yes. Okay, sorry about that. So I was wondering about the paradox that women initiate more the separation, but they lose more in economic terms. So in the well-being is better, but the living standards of women are much lower after divorce than those of men. So, and my question is why? Is that they are much more unsatisfied about marital life and so ready to separate, even the economic price is higher for them. That would mean that value more, they value less money than well-being and other domains of life. Maybe what would be an interpretation. But I ask you, what do you think about this paradox? And you can see, we can see in the results that women lose a lot after divorce, even when they are initiator. They lose in economic terms and after separation. And can I ask my third question? Do you hear me?
I think we would leave it now with two questions and see how much time we still have available. Thank you.
Okay.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your two questions. The first one was whether differences that we observe between initiators and non-initiators through the divorce process is different because initiators anticipate the divorce while non-initiators do not. I'm trying to remember whether I actually show this figure in the paper, and I think I do. So it's that initiators really know much, they anticipate the divorce, while non-initiators do not. So in the survey data, there was also a question on that, and initiators in general, they just say, yeah, I saw the divorce coming, non-initiators do not. So this gives them time to prepare for the separation, and Anne's question is whether that can explain the different trajectories. I think that's a very interesting question. So after I finished that paper, I was actually trying to come up with follow-up questions, and this was actually one of the ideas I had to analyze how anticipating and initiating interact. And I think I ran some preliminary analysis that showed that they interact very strongly, so that then initiators that anticipate look quite a bit like non-initiators that also anticipate the separation. I don't want to go too much into detail on these results right now because I just ran a quick regression and then did this 2 years ago. And was like, this could be a follow-up paper, it's good to know this, but I didn't investigate further. So I don't have data to answer this question. So now, from a theoretical perspective, how I would answer that. The first theoretical perspective I would take is that I'm an economist, so I learned a lot about labor economics, and then I just transfer everything I know about the labor market to the marriage market and assume it's the same thing, basically. When I do that, I make the observation that in labor economics, I have not seen a single paper, I believe, that estimates together whether people lose a job and people that voluntarily move on to the next job or that retire. When I then look at the literature on divorce, we always talk, not always, but nearly always is about divorce as a phenomenon, not about people leaving a partner or being left. While for a job, nobody would make this the same. So now, if I transfer Anne's question to the labor market, I don't think people that lose a job are worse off than people that move on to another job because they did not anticipate it. So I think if this logic applies to one phenomenon, it will also apply to the other. This is a bit very theoretical though, but I just want to say that in that context, nobody would even get the idea that it's about anticipation, even if we would find, yeah? So this is why I'm just skeptical to the argument that it's really anticipation driving it and not what people want. So the most basic theory of human behavior that we have, the rational agent perspective, tells us is about what people want and they become better off. And then this anticipation argument is maybe more accepted in the psychological literature, but for me as an economist, it just feels like very ad hoc as someone, okay, we can also think about it, but yeah, so this is why I'm skeptical. Now, let me think whether I have other theoretical arguments. I think whether people anticipate divorce also has a lot to do maybe with how partnerships are lived nowadays and maybe 50 years ago and maybe in 100 years, how much people talk to each other. So also telling us something about the quality of the partnership. So it's also something, maybe if non-initiators did not anticipate it, then maybe I'm wondering what happened in that relationship before the separation, that the other partner is completely surprised by the divorce. So maybe a couple in which the non-initiator is completely surprised wasn't a good relationship before, while if the non-initiator also anticipates it, it shows that the couple has discussed ways to actually try to salvage the relationship before. So that would then be an indicator of the quality of the relationship that is being reflected in anticipation, but doesn't actually have anything to do with anticipation. It proxies for something else. This is my answer to the first question. The second question was on the paradox that women initiate divorce even though they lose much more economically than men. This is something that has surprised mostly male researchers in the 60s and 70s that first observed this. They were basically asking, how can it be that the women want the divorce? And I think it just reflects that maybe men get more of their social connection or more of their social support through marriage, while women have a more extended social circle. That could be one explanation. So they lose more financially, but they also financially, but not in terms of like their social circle compared to men. The other thing is that in a couple, both partners know how much the other partner would make if they divorced. So then, in the context of in economic theory, this is then modeled as transferable utility, so people can then negotiate. So actually, the higher earning partner, often the man, can tell the wife, look, if you don't do this and that, and if you don't take more household chores, I might as well just leave you and you will be worse off economically. So there's this bargaining taking place, which I very much exaggerated how it happens in a real relationship. I hope it doesn't not like that, but that's the theoretical idea behind it, that people implicitly or explicitly use this to negotiate how much utility each partner gets in the marriage compared to outside. Has this answered your questions?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to continue the opposition now with questions by Professor Dr. Sunjika Fujic. She's a professor of applied econometrics at the University of Antwerp. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Max. Thanks again for including me in the jury of your thesis. I really enjoyed reading it. I can only subscribe to what has been said. I would like to add that I like a lot that you combine the theoretical and the empirical approaches, and you use a wide range of those empirical approaches from event study, DAD matching to time series techniques. So I really like that you bridge also micro and macro empirical approaches. And I also congratulate you to the already 2 chapters being published in very good high-impact journals. So I have a number of questions, and I'll probably send some of you after this defense, but just continuing on chapter number 2, I was wondering about the fact that you defined the long run after the separation to be the 3.5 to 4.5 years. And I wonder whether you've done any robustness checks, because if you look at your results, it seems that if you would extend this period, that both initiators and non-initiators would kind of merge to some kind of stable equilibrium. So I was wondering whether basically doing some additional robustness checks on this long run would make sense. And maybe this long run actually differs for someone depending on the person's perspective, depending on the life cycle for younger people versus somewhat older people. So that's maybe one question. And then also related to that, if I think of your measure of subjective well-being, and I connect it to chapter 3, because in chapter 3, you say in the long run, an individual's subjective well-being is supposed to be anchored at a constant level, predetermined by genetics and personality. So if we take this definition of subjective well-being and put it in chapter 2, so maybe this fluctuation in subjective well-being is only temporary, and it will converge to this constant predetermined level, which is predetermined by genetics and personality. And maybe if I can add up to this discussion, what I also find very interesting that your result on page 21, where we see that once both the initiators and non-initiators enter another relationship, they seem to become dissatisfied with their social life. So maybe a philosophical question, does it mean that the relationships are basically kind of killers of social life and networking, which contributes to well-being? So if you can comment something on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your questions. The first one was a bit whether what I term the long run in chapter 2 of my thesis, the one on separations, is really the long run, or what happens after what I observe. And there I really agree with you that ideally I would have liked to know everything about from birth to death about these people. The fact that I call it the long run in the paper has nothing to do with that I think this is the long run. It was more to have a nice way to write the thesis, this chapter without always having to say 1.5 to 2.5 years after the separation, and then next sentence 3.5 to 4.5. So it's just, I don't mean it as it's the long run, I just wanted the chapter to sound nice. Now you make the point that it could be beneficial to look beyond that time horizon. And I couldn't agree more with you, especially if we look at the figure for initiators. Even in my presentation, I can quickly go back. So these are initiators. So if we look at initiators, it's a V shape. What I would like to see actually would be to have a flat line somewhere. So it would be nice if there's a flat line, then something happens, and then it's a flat line again. And then I would say, wow, okay, this is what happened. But here with this V shape, maybe the decrease already goes on for longer than what I can observe. And maybe also the increase after the separation also goes on for longer than what I observe. In terms of robustness checks that I could do with my data, probably I already did part of that when I wrote it, in that before I chose this specification, I just looked at yearly data from as far as the data would allow, and then I just chose this cutoff because I was like, okay, I still have a reasonable sample size here. It's not just 20% of the separations that I still observe. And I would not have chosen that cutoff if the pattern after or before this observation period would show something completely different. So I just trust the version of myself from 5 years ago that there's nothing super surprising going on. So in that sense, I already did that robustness check. Your second question was, I remember a bit vaguely, but what I remember is that it was about whether people have like a set point in their happiness and whether this contradicts a bit on what I find in chapter 2. Is roughly what I remember. Is this what you had in mind?
Yes, basically yes.
So I think in that sense, also just from a theoretical perspective, one has to think about this rational agent perspective, which says, oh, people can always keep improving their subjective well-being if presented with suitable opportunities. With psychological theory, in which set point theory says, oh, they go back to one fixed point in their well-being. And I think now in psychology, set point theory isn't that well accepted anymore. There are examples of where people really permanently lose in their well-being, but as a reference point, this theory is still being used, because for certain events, we actually do see that people go back to their initial well-being levels. So if there was a set point from what I said before as well, because we have this V shape for initiators, what I said before was basically that we don't observe a set point for initiators here. We have no idea where it could be because we just see change. We don't see a constant line where we are saying like, oh, this should be their set point. And I think a bit in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to your third question.
Very short answer.
Yeah, whether relationships basically kill people's social life. If I exaggerate a bit, they have disadvantages.
Well, this is how I read your conclusion on that.
There's a trade-off, which is probably economists like to say that there's no free lunch, so you always have to choose something. And I think in our societies, where maybe both men and women work and spend 40 hours at work, not all the time everybody, but a lot of people do, then it gives you limited time for other activities. And in this societal context, I think yes, there's a trade-off between having a relationship and a large circle of friends, or how close the other relationships are in your life. Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to Dr. Jessie Bakens, who will continue the opposition. She's a senior researcher at Maastricht University at ROA.
Thank you. Dear candidate, I want to follow the previous opponents in congratulating you on your thesis, and I really enjoyed reading it, and in the achievement of having this many different ways of looking at well-being from the different disciplines. However, I'm here to ask you some questions, and I would like to take the opportunity to ask you one question about Chapter 3 and have a short discussion with you on the policy implications that you state in Chapter 3. Chapter 3 deals with individual costs and benefits of internal migration and whether moving increases well-being or not. The first question is rather specific on the model and the identification strategy. You have individuals in your data set that move or not, and then you estimate the effects of the move on the different indicators of well-being. And what I couldn't find in the analysis, if you can take into account that people might move conditional on something, like finding a job or having a partner. So that, I mean, I only moved to Maastricht if I found a job there first, and I only accept that job if I'm better off in this job than I was in my previous job, or if I improve my labor market situation. So my question is if this might indicate a bias in your treatment group and what that means for the results. The second question, or we can also do the answer first and then the second question.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and the time reading my thesis. If I understand it correctly, it was about whether in the chapter on migration we can really take into account that maybe we have some people that move but that had a job offer already before they moved. So that scenario exactly we cannot observe, but we try to observe as much about them as we can to make the treated group as similar as possible to the control group. What we do have in the survey is a question on how easy they think finding a job is. So there, I'm trying to remember the exact formulation of the question, but I do not. But yeah, it's just how easy would you find to find a job right now. So that's not exactly the same thing. Yes, so if now, you also asked me about the consequences if your scenario was the case. So if in our treatment group, we have people that have a job offer in another city and only then move, we would overestimate in our survey the economic effects of a move. So that's the if thing. And I think this is it's a plausible scenario, but maybe it's also sometimes a bit the case that people who stay in a city because, yeah, they know they can find something there. So this would also be something that we try to measure with this ease of finding a job is. What I'm saying is I think your scenario is quite plausible, but also there's also another scenario with the opposite effect. So then the total effect is somewhat hopefully closer to zero, which I can purely speculate on though, but that would be my defense.
Good, thank you. The second question, also on chapter 3, and it's a policy-related question on place-based versus people-based policies, and I will elaborate a bit on that. We know from research that labor is much less mobile than assumed in most economic models, and this holds especially for lower educated labor. Your conclusion is that moving benefits people financial well-being, and then the policy recommendation at the end of the chapter is design mobility measures that take into account well-being because people lose a bit of well-being with the move. They gain financially, but they lose a bit of well-being. And then my question is, how effective do you think this type of policy will be, or who this policy will benefit most, if you know that many people are immobile, and that this is a bit of a people-based policy solution, right? You invest in the people, but another way could be that you invest in a location to, for example, increase jobs. So I was wondering, based on the research that you do, whether the policy recommendation that you have on well-being of different types, whether place-based policies or people-based policy would be more effective in, I think the ideal result of your research is to get people to match jobs well.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. What I understood is that it's about whether investing in people or in places is more effective, but you also had a sub-question that wasn't about effectiveness, but how something else it was. But maybe that wasn't the important part then. And I'll only stick to the effectiveness part. All right. I think this is a very tough question to answer. If I put on my economist hat and only think in terms of economic models, then the answer I think is super clear to basically only invest in mobility and completely neglect place-based policies. I think, I'm speculating quite a bit here, I don't have a paper to back this up, but I think in general investing in places is much more costly and much less effective in that sense than just paying people to move. And this is especially, I have studied development economics, And there the big discussion is, should we make a poor country, try to make it rich, or just tell everybody to migrate to Western Europe? And from a purely economist perspective, the solution can only be to let everyone migrate, and then it doesn't matter whether the place is poor, because nobody lives there. So this is, I think I'm very radical in my thinking there. And this is the economist hat perspective of myself. This is not my political conviction or my researcher conviction, because now if I leave this economist perspective behind, it's also a lot, about fairness in society. This was your sub-question on who benefits from that, because the people that benefit are mobile people, so younger people, while more educated people that often benefit from moving to cities versus benefiting from the cheaper living conditions in the countryside. But when you, I think I've already stated quite radically what my economist perspective is. So then, to focus a little more on the social perspective, when you look, I think, at current voting patterns, for example, in rural areas, I think this shows very significant some discontent with maybe how cities are benefiting economically also. If you look at Trump in the US, if you look at far-right parties in Germany. But you could also, especially in the case of Germany, make the case that if you look at the social justice perspective, there were really heavy investments in the east of Germany, and people were still not super happy with that place-based policy. So, but I mean, Germany's political history is very complex, and that's not the only thing that's happening there. But that would also, be then in the pro-argument, be a counter-argument in there. So it's complex if you don't just put on your economist hat.
Thank you. I'm going to change the order of the defense a little bit, and the professor next to me already agreed with that. So the opposition will be continued by Dr. Marjolein Muskens, who is a senior researcher at the Institute KBA in Nijmegen. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear Max, many congratulations on this very fine dissertation. I read it with great pleasure and interest, and you use really fascinating data. And that give empirically based insights into the effects of important life events such as divorce. And as you know, I really like working with economists, and I find their way of thinking and analyzing very appealing. And at the same time, I have background in psychology, and I always look at economic research from a psychological perspective, including when reading your wonderful dissertation. So from this angle, I have two questions, or maybe one? Maybe one, okay. You start by describing economic theories where divorce is a rational choice within an expected utility framework. And this seems to form the basis for your expectation that initiators are likely to benefit from divorce and non-initiators are not. But further on, you refer to work from Kahneman from 2016, an important scientist who worked at the intersection of psychology and economics. And this is a quote from his work. People often make systematic errors in predicting their future experiences of outcomes and therefore fail to maximize their perceived utility. And he also mentions that these errors in predicting future outcomes occur specifically when people try to predict their adaptation to new life circumstances, which is typically the case when considering divorce. So, in short, where theories on expected utility frameworks traditionally predict that initiating a divorce will lead to better outcomes for the initiator, the later studies from psychology and economics do not. So, I wonder why the old framework of expected utility has such a prominent place in your predictions. So, my question is, could you perhaps explain to me how you arrived at the choice to apply the old expected utility framework when at the same time you are clearly aware of the more recent literature?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. I think one reason why it's so prominent in this paper is because it's lacking so much in all the other literature on divorce. So the point this paper is really making is that does it still make sense to analyze divorce as an event, and shouldn't every study, like in labor economics, not be something on people that wanted the divorce and did not want the divorce, the same way we analyze whether people lost a job or moved on to another job. So in this sense, or I'm not saying that it definitely argues for this, but I think it kind of asks that question, is like, are we sure we should continue to be doing research on divorce as one event, or whether we shouldn't always try to split this up in that way? And I think for this, to make this argument or to put this question into people's minds, this is why this perspective is so prominent in that paper. Let me think a bit about what other arguments there were, or which other theoretical perspectives I could have highlighted a bit more. So I think I mentioned the other perspectives because I think they're very valid perspectives. But then given the data I have, I can't, or I don't attempt in this paper, and I probably also, it would be very difficult, which is why I did not attempt it, to actually try to figure out how much is like another theory of like feeling in control contribute, or anticipation contribute to it, versus the rational agent perspective. So I think this is a very interesting question, but I'm just not sure how I could answer it. And given what other researchers or what the other literature looks like, I thought this was really the relevant point to make with my article. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Then I would like to continue the opposition with questions by Professor Dr. D.J. Fouage. He's a professor of dynamics of skills allocation and working at Maastricht University for ROA.
Dear candidate, dear Max, I'll give you the short version of the question, given the time, but rest assured that I greatly value the mastery that you displayed in your work. The question is on chapter 4, in which you study the relation between mortality and macroeconomic conditions. And when reading the chapter and reading the title of your thesis, I was wondering whether you consider mortality or death to be a sign of well-being or bad being, or a major life event. But then, reading the summary of your research question on page 146, I say, are bad economic conditions bad for health? So, health, well-being seems to be the same. And that's a rather crude way of looking at health. And so, the reflective question that I would like to ask to you is, why do you take such an extreme view on health and equate it to death? Especially in view of how you are treating subjective well-being in the other chapters, chapter 2 and chapter 3, where also they are operationalized in a way that is way richer than death itself. And also in your presentation, you discussed health or subjective well-being as a decision criterion. And I was wondering, how do you see death as part of the well-being choice decision?
Mm-hmm. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. Yeah, this is for me a surprising question. So what comes to mind spontaneously is a conversation I had with my flatmate. And in Germany there were local elections and there was a party for eternal life. So some kind of somewhat sciencey political party that said they wanted to create eternal life for everyone. So then my flatmate said, I wouldn't even want that because I value my life because it has an end to it. And I then suggested shortening his life further to further increase his well-being. So in this way, I think people think, oh, maybe death is a good thing, but I do not know many people that would agree to bringing it shorter to them. So if you think death creates value, why is it a random point in time that you can't influence? Shouldn't you be able to optimize it? That's the economist's perspective on it.
Can I go ahead on that, so that we haven't ring the bell yet? Huh? So I agree with you, and so that makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, this completely disregards the cardiovascular disease or stress that could go together with bad economic circumstances. So you could have a long life or short life in good health and bad health. So and these are aspects that you are not really discussing, while they are part of chapter 2 and 3 to some extent, life satisfaction, stress, and these kind of things.
Yeah, thank you very much for further discussing this interesting part of this perspective. So one way economists have tried to measure this quality of life is, for example, by quality of life adjusted life years QALYs. I forgot what it actually exactly stands for. To measure that, so that could be also like a very interesting outcome variable, which we have not done here. And I think you could argue that this is actually, in fact, a weakness of the perspective we take in the chapter, because I started this chapter with the goal being like transferring a literature that was present in a lot of other countries to transfer that to the case of France.
You are allowed to finish the answer.
So, because that was the goal, I think I neglected some other aspects. And if I look back on my thesis, the order in which the chapters are is the reverse order in which I worked on them. I think this shows my growth as a researcher as well, that I was trying to copy too much what other people were doing in that chapter maybe, while I was much more confident in putting a focus on something that I thought was interesting, that I thought was worth highlighting in the other chapters. So if I could go back, I would consider your input there very valuable.
Thank you very much. Max Brüning, the time appointed for defending your thesis has now passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. right to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile or die. What's on the line? I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Max Brüning, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. And in view of its positive verdict, and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Dr. Stefan Kuhn is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
All right, please.
Oh. So, Max, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times? To be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Max Brüning, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of Maastricht University. Immediately go ahead. Okay. Dear Dr. Brüning, dear family and friends, Lex and me, unfortunately Lex cannot be here today, so I'm not talking a bit in his name. As your supervisors, we are very proud that you defended your thesis today. You had a difficult period at the end of your PhD trajectory, but you came back and now successfully finished what you have started in October 2017. So let us go back a bit to October 2017 when you started your PhD position here at Maastricht University. For me, this was also a special moment because back then, Max, you were my first really own PhD student that I supervised. And I took quite some time, as you know, to prepare a research plan for Max. But then I learned quite quickly, well, Max is maybe doing it his own way. So as part of the actually intended research project, Max had to work, as we also saw today, with the pair farm data, a quite large and rich longitudinal survey on German households. And I still remember that moment, Max, when I realized that all my plans for you come to an end, like to some degree. Because Max came to my office and then we discussed the results and he said, Stefan, when looking at the data, I found this one question. There is this one question on who initiated the separation when couples split. And it's not just this question, but also it is also answered by both partners. And when thinking about this back, I still can see the light in your eyes, and you somehow fell immediately in love with this variable. And from this moment onwards, your research mainly revolved around this. And although I have to admit that I was not as enthusiastic as you were about this research in the beginning, when we as a supervisor, so Lex and me, we had nothing to complain. You identified the research gap in the literature independently, you implemented the analysis, and finally published your research in this prestigious journal, PNAS, underlying your contribution to science. So looking back, we are very much proud of you, and because you illustrated that you are now a grown-up researcher. Max, you are curious, you are creative, smart, but you also have a very friendly and open personality that we very much appreciate. So you have all the personal characteristics a good researcher needs, plus a finished thesis now, PhD thesis. I think, Max, we both learned a lot during our time together in Maastricht. And me, Lex and me, we really hope that we had at least a little bit of impact on forming the person that you are here today. But of course, 99% of the credits go to your family, parents, and friends. Let me say that and I think also I speak for many other colleagues, we always like working with you. We wish you all the best for the future. Congratulations again, Max. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dear Dr. Brüning, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I also like to congratulate you and all your family and all other people joining you today. Before I close the meeting, so I should also tell that first we are going to make a picture in front of the screen with a couple of people, and afterwards I think we will take a second picture. And in the meanwhile, all the people present in the audience here, they can go to the what you call the refter, and there will be some drinks, I guess. So, and you can wait for us then, and then we will at some point also arrive over there. So, and hereby I end this meeting.